All right, so all of y'all covered a lot, and that's kind of one of the points of being in the layer zero, broadly talking about the ideas and the foundational level of setting up different startup societies. But one element about creating new startup societies is you kind of, I mean, yes, you can rely on will and smart planning and capital and technology, but a lot of it comes down to accidents of history, where the geopolitical and macroeconomic winds are blowing. So in this moment in history, and you talked on this a little bit, Tomas, are we in a moment that's bullish for these projects, or bearish, or is some sort of mixture, and why?
On for creating new.
Yeah, specifically geopolitical or macroeconomic reasons for that.
I think you should start.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's super bullish. I think that, as Thomas said, nation states are overcommitted with like the debt and everything. They're failing. Meanwhile, we have technology lowering the cost of switching. You know, I really feel like this decade is the watershed, like with COVID, right? The number of people who are like, wait, our systems are not working, things are fucked, we need to like redesign our civilization, has just gone up massively. And I also think that crypto helps a lot. Like, it's a great coordination technology, and it gives money to people who believe in these things. And it's just a very 21st century idea, having like startups do jurisdictions and treating your law as a code base. And, you know, small countries are naturally more startup-y. They can make decisions faster. They know that they don't win unless they do something like bold and different. So, and they're really like getting that. So yeah, I think that there's huge tailwinds.
And I think also we need to consider the fact that here we are in the middle of it, and it's a bit hard to get a little bit of perspective. But if you talk about these things outside, very few people know about this, right? And to your point, like if you're organizing something for locals, that's very special, like that's very different than for nomads. If you need nomads, you need a lot of people to be very convinced about this, and that's very, very hard. And it's like the complexity of all the layers that you need to do with the level of awareness that exists today, I think is quite hard. So my understanding is you need the pain to be really felt for people to want to really move. And the pain is going to increase year after year, right? So Europe, we see a lot of this, taxes going up and up and up and up in different countries. And so the pain, and it's only going to get worse because people are getting older and they're the ones voting. And so as the pain goes really, really hard, and as many of these cities figure things out, I think that's when you grow. Just to take a very specific example. The network school in Malaysia, then for a city, they have, I think, 150 to 200 full-time residents. 500 full-time? No, not full-time. Not full-time. But that's full-time plus part-time.
Okay.
So still massive, right? They didn't exist 2 years ago, but they don't have a school, right? They don't have a school, so you can have families, right? And so, and those are very practical things. Where I think what I'm summarizing what I'm saying, the pain is getting better, like bigger and bigger. The ideas are becoming more and more well known. People want to move more and more, and as we do that, cities are figuring out the details of what it takes to get people, and so I think the growth is going to be exponential from here.
Obviously, I have a lot invested in making sure that your prediction is correct. This is a bullish moment. However, one counterpoint that some people may give is, for instance, Thiel, he often bifurcates between crypto as a decentralizing force and AI as a centralizing force. Obviously, it depends on which and what your predicted outcome is. You know, surveillance, you know, the centralization of industry that could lead to nationalization and then further surveillance. Is there a world that the tide could turn because of that technology, or do you see it eventually as a decentralizing force that would be to our favor?
I mean, I think that AI is on net decentralizing. Yeah, it's great for like surveillance, but you can just think of it like there are economies of scale in this world, right? And the larger the organization, the more it can afford to like have a bunch of people do stuff. And with a smaller organization, having AI do stuff for you is much, much higher impact. So like what I'm seeing from people using AI is there's way, way more happening with it empowering individuals. It's not to say that it doesn't also empower governments to control us, but I think that that's relatively much smaller.
In AI, there are two camps. One, obviously, the big companies who have proprietary frontier engines, but open source, and especially open source AI that is local first, meaning it's not tied to something beyond what you have in your domain. That is something that is a natural ally, and I think the more that we can catalyze experiments on the part of people, broad masses of people, to use this kind of AI for tangible benefit and create little video uploads, YouTube, TikTok, showing how this has helped remove barriers to their lives and to the lives of their friends. There's a VC, part of the Moonshots podcast, Dave London, who says what VCs are looking for now are people not with degrees, which obviously has been fading as an on-ramp barrier, but they're looking for friendship networks and people who are fearless, who are young and diving straight into what can be done. So this again ties into how free zones can become on-ramps and become catalysts for a wave of micro-entrepreneurship using open source, local first innovations for documented benefit.
Very quickly, I think we need to also acknowledge the fact that we have no fucking clue what's going to happen after the singularity, and it might come soon, right? So, okay, what happens after in 5 years we have ASI? Nobody has any idea, and it's important because here we're talking about things that take decades, and this is going to take very possibly less than a decade. So we just don't know. To your point, I do agree though that if things continue the way they are, it's going to be very hard for any single government, maybe outside of China, to really control enough of what's going on to be able to eliminate all the freedom that we can create by using AI, each of us.
Okay, superintelligence is centralizing. I totally grant you that.
So you mentioned a point, Tomas, about awareness of these types of projects. I noticed something very strange, and probably a lot of practitioners or studiers here of this field have noticed it, and it's very specific. In the last year, specifically July, if you look at Google Trends, if you look at the words startup societies, charter cities, SEZs, free zones, its network states skyrockets around July. And I've been trying to pinpoint it, and I've seen in our organizations too, like the Journal of Special Jurisdictions, 3x its readership. There's a bunch of people reading about it, and I'm trying to pinpoint why. I mean, there's Trump with freedom cities. You know, the Palestinian free zones are part of the deal, potentially. The Ukrainian free zones, network states, maybe it hit critical mass. Is it a confluence of factors that have led to this, or is there one factor that could lead to such a large-scale growth?
I don't know the question. I don't know the answer at all. But I think you're asking a question on how do we make these grow? That's the underlying. Can we why these grow, and can we make it happen?
Why is it growing now, and how can we double down?
Yeah, I don't know why it grew. For the growing from here on, there's a million ways to do this, right? There's still some port cities that we can do, like Singapore and Dubai. There are lots of learnings from tech companies, because when we talk about cities and growing cities, the issue that we have is a cold start problem, right? There's network effects. That's where the values of cities is. The bigger they are, the bigger they are. And so the difficulty of getting from 1 to 10 and 10 to 100 and 100 to 1,000 is as hard as from getting to 100,000 to a million and a million to 10 million, right? And so the beginning really, really matters. And so I think to me, like that's why I think we should be obsessing about this 10 to 100, 100 to 1,000, 1,000 to 10,000. And there I think there's a lot of mechanics that we can learn from many other places. Like for example, this is a problem that tech companies have been facing for 10, 20 years, and there's playbooks on how to solve this. Like for example, one way to think about it is if you take a marketplace, you have supply and demand. You need to, like sometimes for a marketplace, you need to go for supply, and you artificially create supply, and then demand comes, and things like this. What is the equivalent for cities? Well, the supply for me is jobs, I believe, and the demand is workers. And so how do you, can you grab a way to put 10,000 jobs in one single place, and then the workers are going to come? These are the type of problems that I think really, really matter.
Are cities only labor markets, though, or are they something more than that?
It's huge, and there's a million things you need to solve. Because if you have 10,000 jobs and there's crime and the city looks like shit, nobody wants to come.
Right.
So that's why I think creating cities is by far the hardest kind of startup that you can create, because you need a person who knows about a very big vision and knows about like 10, 20 different topics really, really, really well to do them well. But the core is the job, because the core is the money. If you don't have money, you cannot live. And so the first thing you need to do really, really well is get the jobs.
I utterly take issue with what you've described. I think we're likely now to be moving into an era of bots, physical and virtual, doing the work, doing the tedious things, and jobs, I think, are going to vanish in terms of the traditional view of a sinecure that you can credential for through institutions. What I think this opens up, though, is an amazing prospect for the next generation of startup societies, which is not so much places that offer jobs, but they offer ways to live life as you, the sovereign individual, want it to be lived. The growth of Airbnb has been enormous, and it's brought people into contact with what it means to be a host. And Airbnb is adding experience to the lodging. They think, the founder at least thinks, Brian Chesky thinks that will be bigger than the lodging, bundling in experiences. So the sooner skills in conviviality and serendipity come into people's lives, and the skills of being a good host, as Spencer McCollum and Joyce have underlined, this is the future. It's not going to be one of working necessarily, unless you've got a passion and do it out of love, as well as what other upsides come. So I think it's much more interesting to focus on that opportunity than put it back into the category of, oh, we're going to bring these number of jobs to you.
I mean, I guess I see losing jobs to AI as more of a first world problem, and I think that like in the next decade, people in the global south will still mainly have jobs. And in survey data, jobs is by far the #1 reason why people move. The #2 reason is family, to be closer to family, like family reintegration, which is huge, generally like a negative for charter cities. So I completely agree, like the cold start problem is huge, and the economic engine is central. And in 20 years, that may change for the entire world. I think it could, but I think that for the next decade, jobs still really matter.
I do think Mark has a point that, well, who knows? Maybe we'll, through Neuralink and others, we'll be able to speed up the rate in which we can learn new skills. But there could be a good chance that cities don't become labor markets; they become markets for something else. But the problem is with that is you can't make culture. Entities that try to make culture turn into cults. Or just very weird types of scenarios. And there's even been startup societies that specifically tried to build a culture, and they end up very cult-like. And there may or may not be some projects like that right now. Who knows? But culture, no matter what, is an important piece of all this. If people don't align, and if there's friction, and if it becomes something toxic, it can fail. So you can't create culture, but you can't ignore it. How do you walk that line to make sure that you create something that's actually healthy while it's actually achievable?
I agree that creating culture is very, very hard. I think the best founders in tech companies do it all the time. And so I think it's very hard, but it's not impossible. And I'll give you a few examples. I think most concepts that I've seen of new cities completely underestimate the importance of urbanism. Some don't, but some do. And so, like, if you are, like, this is, by the way, something that I've talked about with Prospera people. When you have 3 or 4 different areas in the Prospera region, that means that you need a car for everything. And that means that suddenly you have a car-focused culture. And that means that you cannot be walking from each other's house, and then you don't have the local community that emerges from that. And so that decision, which is something that, like, there's lots of reasons for this, but I don't think there was enough focus on this part. Like, they have a huge building here. There's so much that could be built around this to create community locally. And I know they've been doing more of this lately. And that's just an example of how important some of these things are to create culture. Urbanism is one, and there's many more of these. And so that's why I'm saying it's so hard to create a new city, because you need to know about, like, these 10 or 20 different disciplines to really, really do it well.
I mean, I think it's easy to screw up trying to, like, create or influence culture, but I do think it's doable. And to me, it's all about, like, you should be learning from your community what the culture is much more than you should be telling them what it is. But there shouldn't be zero active influence. You should be, like, trying things, trying to set values, trying to set, like, activities, but these are, like, experiments, and the culture is something that's organic and out there. Right? And I think that you can mess with it, you can influence it, and the problem happens when you're trying to, like, directly create or control it.
Yeah, again, this comes a little bit into questioning the premise. There are millions of formative cultural experiences now going on outside of state schools. Through micropods, through homeschooling, peer learning networks. These, I think, are the seedbeds of very healthy future cultural change. One of the most amazing things I've come across recently is the Alpha School, which is popping up around the US now. And what they're doing is making an irresistible proposition to parents and to the kids. It is that 2 hours will go into academics every day. AI during those 2 hours, using the avatars that the people that you most admire, their avatars are going to be the ones explaining trigonometry to you. You choose, and they are super tuned in to your learning style, your learning pace. So for 2 hours, they're getting 3x, 5x advances over what traditional schools are doing. But the cultural part of the shift is the reward once you finish that 2 hours is the rest of the day is for your projects, the ones you love. It's your time. And the role of the adults through this whole process is not as teachers, but as coaches, mentors, pointers to things maybe you should check out. And this transforms the spirit, the culture, and the hope horizons of kids, because they are seeing and they're interacting off each other's energies because they're doing what brings them joy.
All right, shout out to Alpha School graduate Rhett over there, who raised his hands, who built 2 bike parks as his project. And if you have questions about what Alpha School is like, ask him.
So let's head back to governance. So the highest alpha generally is in spaces that people don't focus as much on. In governance, people tend to focus on taxes, and there's a lot of good literature about why that's overwrought and why it doesn't actually have that much of an impact. What is a non-sexy element of governance that can be tweaked or modified or improved in one of these experiments that can have an outsized income in your experience?
I mean, I disagree on taxes in the sense that if you view it as a product, like there's the price and then there's what you get for it. And taxes and fees are the price, and I think that that's just like any product. It is absolutely foundational to the product to give people more for less money. And so not from like a libertarian taxes are evil, not from that perspective at all. Just straight up, you're making a product and you want customers, and the price of that product is always intensely relevant. But it's a fascinating question, is like, yeah, what are the other like less sexy things? I mean, I guess I kind of tend to think that like the issue is at a higher level. Like we've got public choice theory showing that like democracies will consistently produce policies that benefit special interests at the expense of the masses, for mechanism design reasons around coordination costs. And so to me, it's kind of like just, if you compare how things work in like a Singapore or like the US, it's just like, like everything works worse. And so to me, like the big value is having like an incentive aligned like way of creating the rules, and then you're going to make like everything work better, as opposed to there being like one lever.
Lee Kuan Yew in the 1980s was dealing with a lethargic civil service. And what he did that transformed the culture of the public sector there was introduce flex-wage. It's now called national bonus. It indexes every civil servant's paycheck to the growth rate of the economy in the previous 12 months. So all of a sudden, instead of, my wife is Brazilian, and there's an expression in Portuguese, why facilitate when you can complicate, as the default attitude of the public sector worldwide. Not in Singapore. That is radically against the interests and what's now the culture of the public service there, because they know they have skin in the game, directly, systematically. The second thing Singapore and Hong Kong and Macau have done is change the government's role fundamentally to being one of a landlord that gets feedback every auction of lease rights, long-term leases, is a barometer of how much trust there is in the quality and transparency of the business climate. So they depend way more than the US on land rent, land value taxes for funding the public sector. And that clarifies, again, Spencer McCollum, I wish were still here with us, but he and his grandfather were at the forefront of seeing how the private sector, when it's in a land owning role with guests, with tenants, behaves in ways that the governments worldwide fall way short of, except perhaps in the case of Singapore, which is a landlord.
Yeah, maybe just add just a couple of things. When I look at history and the governments that enabled more wealth to be generated, there's a couple of patterns. The number one role of government is safety. And I don't think that's understood well enough by governments. You can see it in the empires that I mentioned before against the pirates, but it's not just that. Like literally trade and business wants to happen, and the number one thing that hinders it is crime. It's violence. And so the number one thing, which I think is a completely underrated reason why both Singapore and Dubai grew, is because it's extremely, extremely safe. If you make a place that's extremely safe, that's the first thing they need to do. And then along those lines, a lot of what the government, so the second thing is also infrastructure. There's like people forget about this, but infrastructure is very expensive. You need usually to centralize it. It's not a coincidence that both Singapore and Dubai are started with ports, but also they have amazing highways, they have amazing airports, and so on and so forth. And that is a very important thing for the government to make. So crime is huge, infrastructure is huge, and then the other thing is just don't get too much in the way, because business just wants to happen. So many times they're very well intentioned, but in that case, I agree with you. That's where the less is more comes in place.
So one thing that we can control is the type of founders that are working on these types of projects. Patri, you made a comment that you think that there's fungibility between the type of founder that founds a tech company versus founds this type of projects. However, I just want to push back and see what can come of it. There are different factors and obstacles that a founder of a startup society encounters than a tech founder. In a tech founder, you are, what Elon says is you're dealing with a wall of overwhelming competency at these places. They're heavily funded, they're very logical individuals that are driven, and even when they are doing stakeholder relations, they're usually doing it with investors who are former tech people, have very similar personality types. Versus if you are a startup society founder, you are dealing with multiple levels of stakeholders with a vast different array of personalities, objectives, and viewing of the world. A tech entrepreneur and a politician, on average, have very different personality and mindsets. And that's just one of the stakeholders, not mentioning grassroots, the press, and what have you. Are there elements that a startup society founder should have that are particular to that field that a traditional tech founder does not?
I mean, I don't mean tech founders. I more mean founder like a person who creates a new thing, particularly a person who creates a new business. And that doesn't have to be tech, right? You could start a line of restaurants. I think that there's a lot of skills to that are just common to successfully starting new things, especially for-profit businesses, that mostly translate. Which is not to say that there's not also like industry-specific things. For example, I think that community. I mean, look at the benefit that Nicholas, for example, has brought to Prospera by coming here and just starting to run events and get people here. Like a huge amount of the awareness of Prospera, the people writing stories about it, and the people who have been here is because he came in with a community focus and said, let's start getting people here. So I think that community, and to what Thomas said, the cold start problem is brutal. How do you have the skills to get a community of 100 people who will move somewhere together? Do you have the skills to grow that to a community of 1,000 people who will move somewhere together? So I think that community is a specific aspect, and then I would say that government and regulations, like a lot of tech founders are just trying to ignore regulations as much as possible. They're in a space where that's minimal, whereas for a charter city, you need to be working with a government, talking with heads of state, you need to be helping them write zone laws, and then you need to be developing your regulatory system so that comfort with governance and partnerships with government-type entities is another thing that I think is unique to our space.
Well, let's close with the Telian question. What is your contrarian opinion on this space specifically?
We'll soon see, but we may be in a threshold that our species has never been at, which is the world of scarcity is going to be optional. People will more and more have choice, and they will go to places that have the conviviality, that have the safety, have the sense of adventure. And about 80 or 90% of startup community projects fail, intentional communities, for example, if they're absent, if there's no higher purpose, no shared connection with some transformational purpose. And so I think the key thing that's missing in our space is the room for the inspirers, the culture makers, the companions on these adventures. Each of us, I think has visions and dreams, and we'll be able, in ways we haven't before, to find kindred spirits and coordinate not initial 10 or 100 person crowd moves, but commitments, say, to travel to your next project and become essentially e-residents with some visiting right. And then the pace of connection intensifies by getting those initial experiences to work. So I think short stay rentals is a huge opportunity. With our rentals in Virginia, we're introducing a neighborhood share, which is setting aside a portion of the Airbnb rentals for things that help the neighborhood and engage people, including the renters, if they wish to stay virtually connected.
So, Patri and Tomas, it looks like you were saved by the bell. We're out of time. But please make sure to ask them in person. Everyone, give a round of applause for our panel.